his holiday, but also his work, sitting in Madrid of all the places, to come and talk to us today about a subject which has actually created a lot of interest among the HCD crowd, but even beyond that. And we are very, very fortunate to have Jens come and talk to us. He's somebody who's well known to a lot of you. He is today affiliated with a couple of organizations. BCG is one of them. ISTOR is another one. And he has a long and illustrious career, of course, with the likes of Roche and also Novartis. You were also with Novartis, Jens, right?
And Pfizer, and Smith Beecham, and Merck, yes.
Okay. You've done the whole round, yeah. So I would actually like to hand over to you, and then you can start. So over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Simon, and thanks everybody for joining. I joined HCD earlier this year. It's a very interesting community. I'm impressed by all the chat that is ongoing in here, and I've seen that value and healthcare is something which is very high on the agenda for that. So when Simon asked me to speak about value-based pricing, I immediately accepted that. As a little of the background, Simon already mentioned that. So I have 3 affiliations at the moment. I'm employed by the Boston Consulting Group as a partner. I spend 80% of my time with that, and I spent the other 80% with the University of Washington, where I'm an affiliate professor in the Comparative Health Outcomes and Policy Institute at the School of Pharmacy, and I'm also the 2020-21 president of ISPO. Also relevant for this is that before joining BCG, I spent 25 years in the pharmaceutical industry. So I started as the global head of pricing at Novartis in 1999, and later became the senior vice president for global access at Roche, which is also something that is relevant in this context. Access is more than price. Access is what is really important for patients in the end and for health systems. But we're focusing on the pricing element in here. Final point, I quickly want to say that I'm not speaking on behalf of any of these affiliations here. So these are my personal thoughts. Of course, they are strongly influenced and biased by the history that I have with these things.
Jens, thank you so much. That's a very, very impressive background that you come with. And for the benefit of everybody, before you start your presentation, this session is being conducted under Chatham House rules, which means that you are allowed to ask any questions. We will not attribute answers to anybody in particular. We will do a recording of the session, and depending upon the sensitivity or otherwise, we will share the recording through our LinkedIn site. We will also have a longer presentation that Jens has very kindly agreed that he can share for the benefit of all the HCD participants. So, Jens, shoot.
Thanks very much. So to start with, the concept of value is something which is, of course, very important in healthcare, and I was want to put it into the context of value-based healthcare concept that has been made popular by a famous book by Michael Porter and Elizabeth Teichberg about 15 years ago, where they speak about a value-based competition and outcomes for patients as one of the solutions for making healthcare better in quality and lower in cost. So this is a starting point in the middle of all of these discussions is how can we improve outcomes that matter to patients while at the same time reducing cost. And in the value-based healthcare setting, that means we have to target specific population segments with our interventions. We need to have documentation of the outcomes, so it's important to have informatics about that, so that we can benchmark the outcomes that are produced, can compare them, can improve them, and then look at what's the delivery organization that we need to produce these outcomes, and what are the payments that are then resulting from these delivery organizations, so that the payments are not related anymore to the volume of services that are produced, but really reflecting the outcome that is delivered to patients. And that is something which is particularly important also in the context of healthcare technologies, complex healthcare technologies like drugs, but equally medical devices, digital therapeutics, diagnostics. They're all characterized by a long, expensive, and risky development process. So only 1 out of 1,000 molecules that is synthesized in the early stages, actually making it to market. When they make it to market, they can be produced very efficiently at scale. But if we were only paying these products on the basis of their cost, this would not allow investment into these areas. They are global public goods. They're available to everybody in the world. In principle, everybody can benefit from the knowledge that is behind that. But we need some form of intellectual property protection for this, and this protection allows a temporary monopoly for the inventor for this specific technology, for this specific invention. There can be things which are similar but not identical to this, so it doesn't protect from competition, but it allows to charge a price that is based on the value and the performance rather than the cost of this. And that is time constrained. That is typically for 10 to 12 years when these technologies are reaching the market. After that, loss of exclusivity, generic or biosimilar competition can come in. People that can produce the same molecule, whether it's a chemical molecule or biologic molecule, can then produce this. That will drive down the cost through competition, and then we will have a much cheaper product at the marginal cost of production plus a small profit margin for the eternity of mankind for this. So that's something which you always have to keep in mind, that value-based prices are time limited, and then we are all benefiting from this invention when it is available as a generic. But it also creates some tension in the market because we have these two pricing principles coexisting with each other. We have some medicines that may cost tens of thousands of dollars for patients to treat, and then we have others where we can buy a month's of supply for $1 a day. And I think these are not in contradiction with each other. It is just reflecting different points in the life cycle of these inventions. When we look at value in healthcare, there are three principles that are important in particular when we think about drugs and medical technologies for that. First of all, as we all say, that value is in the eye of the beholder. So different stakeholders have different perspectives and look at a different set of value elements. Pharma has a different perspective than the payer, which may be health insurance, which is often supported by what we call HTA bodies, a health technology assessment organization like NICE in the UK or IQWiC in Germany. Academia may have a different perspective on the science that is behind this, and physicians and caregivers have a different perspective, and of course the patient may have a completely different perspective for that. The second point, that from the perspective of the inventor, we should dissociate value, price, and access for this. So the first thing is that value is a description of the relative attributes of this product or service compared to the next best alternative here. And that is something which we need to understand. What does it mean from a medical perspective, from a patient perspective? That can have a certain price. And if the price is aligned with the value of this technology, then there will be coverage and access for patients and healthcare providers to use these technologies. And when there is a disconnect between value and price, the price is too high compared to the value, then this will not work. But this is what HTA organizations, for example, are looking at. And the third thing is that the perception of value will be modified by different contexts in there. If there is a very high unmet need, we may be willing to pay more for this. So this is a big question at the moment for new technologies for Alzheimer's disease, for example. There is a huge unmet need for that. And many people for decades have tried to develop medicines for this. Because of this high unmet need, we may be willing to pay more for the first medicines because they will pave the way for future innovations. And there is an element of uncertainty in there. If it's highly certain that I can generate that value, then of course I'm willing to pay more. If there is only a 50-50 chance, that is not good. And then we may have a different perspective of what that value is. And when that is translated into price, then there are two things that people are looking at. One is the cost effectiveness. So this is the question of allocated efficiency, as health economists would put that in there. So relative to other uses of my restricted budgets, is that price something where I should really then invest in that? Or does it turn out that I'm kind of generating less health with this technology than other things that I might be paying for? And what is the budget impact? There may be things, and you've probably followed this when the first medicines came out for hepatitis C. that there was a large group of patients out there, 2.5 million patients alone in the US, that could be treated with these medicines. The medicines, they were highly cost effective. They were as expensive as existing medicines, but they were actually curing patients from the disease. So the price looked high, $84,000, but it was really a good investment for that. But $84,000 times 2.5 million is about the total budget of the U.S. healthcare system. So that was not something that was possible then to fund. So these are all the different aspects that we need to keep in mind. And then when we are more specific, then there are different value characteristics that are often looked at to establish the value. It's the clinical benefit, that's the starting point, of course, and that's probably most important. What does it really do for that patient in need? But it also affects the patient caregivers and healthcare providers in there. So we now have medicines that can deal with genetic birth defects in children. And it has a huge benefit for children, but it also has a huge benefit for the family in terms of how they can now care for these babies. It has a healthcare system benefit in that it may improve the efficiency of the healthcare system. It may require less testing and less treatment for side effects of these medicines. And it has a social and macroeconomic benefit, which is basically that we can all be more productive and that we can be beneficial members of our communities and societies in there. So these are different value perspectives that will be included when you speak about the value of medicines or other technologies in healthcare. And depending on your perspective, you include or not some of these characteristics. In the UK, for example, the benefits are very much restricted to the healthcare system, whereas a country like Sweden would say, no, we also look very clearly at the social and macroeconomic benefits. There are different reasons why those different perspectives are coming in. All countries have established some mechanisms how they try to assess the link between the value that is generated and the price that is being charged for these medicines. There are a number of countries. It is the old British Commonwealth in particular, so England, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, but also countries like Sweden, the Netherlands, that are using cost effectiveness based on incremental cost effectiveness thresholds for that. So in these countries, all of the benefits that we saw on the slide before would be somehow translated into a utility for patients, and that leads to something which is called the quality adjusted life year. The idea is that the number of life years that are being gained is important, but they also need to be weighted with the quality of that life. So if I'm bedridden despite the treatment, that may be different than if I'm jumping around and can lead a perfect life. And even and also in situations where medicines may not have an impact on the duration of life, but they are relieving pain and they're improving my functional abilities, that is a benefit that is generated. So these countries are very much trying to bring everything together in a quality, and then they look at how many qualities are generated and what is the incremental cost that needs to be paid for that. And then they relate that to a threshold. And in England, they would say that if it turns out that this is costing me less than £20,000 per quality adjusted life year gained, then this is definitely something that I should adopt. If it's more expensive than 30,000, that is probably not something I would usually pay for. If it's in the middle, then I may need to consider targeting it to a specific population where the benefit is less, or where the benefit is better than investing £20,000 per quality. Here, price is directly an input into that value assessment, so it's all lumped together. There is no specific minimum benefit that needs to be attained. If the incremental cost is low, then also small benefit is good. There is no specific price negotiation, but if I'm setting a price as the inventor that is not leading to a positive appraisal, then I will be rejected. I have to go back, and 3 months later I go through the same discussion again. So I'm losing time. Patients lose time to get access to these medicines. And as I said, some countries use a broad perspective and others limit to health system impact. There is another system which we're seeing in many countries, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Japan, as some of the protagonists here. They use a two-step pricing approach. It's also identifying the value, but here the point is, first of all, I want to understand purely from a clinical and patient perspective, is there an added benefit? And if there is no added benefit, then things are simple, then I just set the price based on the lowest price that is already in the market. So their strategy here is to say, I can deal with 50% of all these things that come to market because it is not clear whether they're any different or any better than what is there. But for those products that actually have a benefit, I can be generous. I don't want to have a fixed formula for that. Even if for a certain period of time this is still expensive, I know that eventually the price will come down, competition will come in, patent exclusivity will expire for that. So they will then have a negotiation, but these are different than a threshold-based negotiation. The focus is on patient-relevant benefits. This is one of the big discussions in there. So the German legislation, for example, says that patient-relevant benefits are mortality, morbidity, and quality of life. It's all related to the patient. So benefits for the mother, the family, and others are not considered directly in this. So that's one of the criticisms, that broader perspectives of value are not considered very consistently. But it doesn't. It may include some assessment of cost effectiveness, but it doesn't deal with a specific threshold. Very specifically in Germany, for example, the law says that we're not trading off one disease, patient in one disease against patient in another disease. There is nothing that says, okay, if I can benefit more in patients with hypertension, I should then do less for patients with cancer. Implicitly, that is included in some of the approaches in countries that use cost effectiveness. How will then this value-based price look? It always starts with the comparator price. That's your starting point for it. And then you would look at these different components of that, and you would see kind of what is the economic value of the clinical benefit that is provided. In the UK, that's a calculation that's based on the quality gains that are being generated. In other countries, it's based on a negotiation. Am I willing to pay for all the additional patient or caregiver benefits? How valuable is that for me as a payer, as a society? How do I value healthcare systems benefits, the cost savings that are being generated, the efficiency that is being created? And are there ways then to also reward social and macroeconomic benefits, that people are more productive, that people don't have to go to long-term institutional care? So this is this kind of upflowing waterfall, or this bridge between the comparator price and the value-based price, is almost like a mathematical formula in some countries, and it is a deliberative process in other countries. All of the different countries would have a clear notion that they say proof is better than promise. The inventor may say it is obvious. I mean, this drug is so great. This new device is such a wonderful thing. But on the other hand, the payers would say, well, I need some proof for that. I need clinical data, evidence that this drug actually does what it's supposed to do. Traditionally, that was based on randomized clinical trials. They are similar to the randomized clinical trials that are required for regulatory approval. These clinical trials are controlled experiments. They try to optimize the signal-to-noise ratio, which explains why they have a very strict protocol, so that in the fastest period of time we can really find out, are there any specific benefits that are attributable to the experimental therapy before we have exposed too many patients to these drugs. So that's an important point. It's not that randomized clinical trials are unrealistic. They are very realistic from a patient safety perspective. But then people say, well, we also need the real world data, because in the real world, a few things are different. We're treating different patients. We hardly ever treat elderly patients in clinical trials. We don't treat pregnant women in clinical trials, patients with comorbidities. In the real world, that is absolutely going to happen. So on top, as a complementary source of evidence, increasingly people are looking at real world data. So these are data that could be from administrative systems in the healthcare setting, or they may be registries, and increasingly data that is generated from electronic health records for patients. COVID has had many impacts on societies. One of the positive impacts on healthcare systems that it has had, that we are going to have much better real world data, and we've all seen the benefits of getting the data from Israel or from Scotland to really understand what the real world effectiveness of the vaccines is. And the Important point from a pay perspective is that evidence generation is a continuous process. It doesn't stop when the therapy is introduced into the market. So we actually want to generate that new evidence. We want to understand how this drug works against new therapies that come into the market as the therapy is being optimized based on the rational experimentation that is ongoing in the market. So value-based pricing is always linked to the evidence, and a friend of mine was always making the statement, price is a function of the quality and the strength of the clinical evidence that we have for this medicine. And that is indeed the case, because it is based on outcomes, it is based on the value that is being generated. Often, you don't have the certainty about these outcomes. If you have an acute therapy, you can pretty quickly find out whether in an advanced cancer setting, for example, the drug does what it should, that the patient is surviving, that the tumor growth is controlled. In many areas, it takes a long time to manifest these. That was a big discussion, of course, also in the context of COVID, that we have experiments for a year, but then we are asking kind of how long does the protection last for this. So often when we speak about value-based pricing, it's also that they are linked to innovative contracts that would then try to reduce the uncertainty that exists around the value of these therapies. And on the left-hand side, I've listed a number of these sources of uncertainty, whether it's variable treatment outcomes for the patient, whether it's questions about the duration of the benefit, whether it's situations where I have to pay a lot of money up front, and I don't know whether I will actually ever get the benefits out of that. And then there are different pricing solutions. They're all trying to implement value-based pricing. One thing that has become quite popular over the last years is pay for performance, really to say that I'm willing to pay that price if I get these benefits. If the patient doesn't get the benefit, I want the manufacturer to pay back part or all of the cost of the treatment. So these are ways that you can implement value-based prices in practice. And an important example, just to kind of show you how has that happened, you may have heard about CAR T therapies. This is one of the big cell and gene therapy advances that we have seen over the last few years. These products are correcting a gene defect. It's not a product, it's actually a process for this. The first products were approved 3 or 4 years ago. They cured about 50% of the patients, and there were many questions. I mean, we want to have this technology available for patients, but we don't have long-term experience what these manipulations with cells and genes actually mean for those patients. So Novartis was one of the companies that brought one of the first products to market for children with an advanced form of cancer, and also for adults with a different kind of blood cancer. And the payment scheme here was that there was a payment of 50% at the beginning of the treatment, and then 50% after 18 months. There's the Spanish situation, some other countries, there were different schemes behind that, but after 18 months based on the outcome. So was the patient still responding to the therapy? Was the patient still alive at that therapy? So this was something that helped alleviate the payer concern about the outcome for patients. They only paid the full price when these patients were actually surviving longer than 18 months. And when they survived more than 18 months, they would very likely survive 3 years, 5 years. So that was a sign that this drug had a real strong effect on these patients. And with this approach, these therapies were approved very quickly. So Novartis, in a way, set a new world record for the time to coverage in the National Health Service in the UK. It was 10 days from the marketing authorization for access for children to this medicine. Usually it may take a year or longer to negotiate the prices. Within 1 year, most patients in Western Europe had access to these therapies. Often it takes 2, 3, 4 years to achieve that. So here, the one point that the price was linked to the value that was generated, and the second point that there was also a performance guarantee that limited the uncertainty around that value, led to this being available for patients very quickly. An interesting concept that is almost like a corollary to value-based pricing means that a product may have more than one value-based price. many medicines, many medical technologies can be used in different settings for that. So a cancer medicine may be used in different cancers, and immunology medicine may be used for patients with rheumatoid arthritis and psoriasis and other immunologic diseases. So something which is sometimes a little kind of difficult to grasp is, but I'm buying a product, but I'm paying a price that is then based on the way that this product is being used, specifically in what patients is this product being used. But it makes a lot of sense, because if we are not setting the price based on that, there may be situations where the price that has been set is too high. And so certain patients will not be able to get access to this treatment because the payer would reject the coverage for that. Or there may be situations where the value of the product is much higher, and then the innovator is not rewarded for that. And that may result in extreme situations where the innovator might say, well, if I cannot achieve a price, I should invest my money elsewhere, and I'm not going to develop certain indications that might be relevant for patients. So not differentiating the price by different indications is something that is not good from an inventor perspective, also from a patient and societal perspective. So we are now seeing a lot of situations where the same medicine may have a different price. Sometimes is that the medicine is physically differentiated across different indications. So we have some medicines that are being used for cancer indications and for ophthalmology indications. So in the eye, it's the same molecule. It's called Eylea in the eye, and it's called Zaltrap when it is used for cancer. But there is a tenfold difference in price between that, based on the benefit that it delivers to patients. It may be possible to do this contractually. So I was involved with a product called Avastin that is used in 7 different cancer indications, and it had 7 different prices in Italy. There was one nominal price that was linked to the initial indication for this product, but then whenever there was information that the product was being used in different cancers, then there was a discount that was provided by the manufacturer back to the Italian health system, and that was based on a simple registry where it was documented for what purpose the drug was used. Some countries like Germany and Australia are saying, well, I mean, we're setting a weighted average price across the different indications, and we're adjusting that. It is possible in these countries because there is not much price sensitivity at the provider level, so the hospitals could all use these medicines, but sometimes if there is price sensitivity for the providers, the weighted average price will not work. The other corollary of value-based pricing is that products will have a different price across the world, because the value that is associated with the different ingredients there depends on what are the other costs in healthcare system. What do we pay for physicians, for nurses? What do we pay for hospitals and for other drugs in the market? So when you find that the price in India is different from the price in Portugal or in Germany, that makes perfect sense because it reflects the different situations in these countries. And I've just listed here, I mean, basically every major pharma company now has a commitment to value-based pricing. They call it international differential pricing to make these products available in different countries at a cost that is affordable in these countries. Now, there is a problem with that it is nowadays very transparent what these prices are. And within Europe, for example, there is a principle of international reference pricing. So one country looks at the price in other countries and then tries to get the best price out of that. And that makes perfect sense when different countries have similar economic situations. So there is a group that is called Beneluxa that includes Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Austria, and Ireland. It makes perfect sense that they are referencing each other's prices because these countries are quite similar. But it doesn't make sense that Germany would reference the price in Greece or in Romania. And it doesn't make sense that Romania references the price in Kenya for a medicine. So we need some form of social solidarity to implement the differential prices. And that is why you find that companies are now going to different ways to kind of hide the actual price that are being paid for that. So I was involved in this example here. I have to speed up a little bit, but tell you, I mean, Roche has 2 very important cancer medicines. They've been on the market for many years. They can cure patients, women with breast cancer, with a specific type of breast cancer, and patients with a specific with various types of blood cancers. Until 2013, there was one price for these medicines around the world. And that was probably okay at that time because most of the patients were in North America and Western Europe. But in 2014, these medicines were also included in the WHO essential medicine list. Because cancer is now also becoming a pressing public health issue in many developing countries, now that we are seeing the shift from communicable to non-communicable diseases. So the question for Roche was, how can we get access in countries, in upper middle income, in middle income, in lower middle income countries? The approach was differential pricing. And Roche experimented with that. Initially, the price were differentiated by 30%, 50%, eventually more than 70%, sometimes through innovative contracts. And it doubled access for patients in low and middle income countries in a relatively short period of time, in 4 years, from before only 29% of the population being able to have coverage for these medicines if they were diagnosed with these cancers, to then more than 50% of patients. So these are examples that these companies are extremely proud of, and how we can make that work. Often you will find that this is then done through confidential arrangements. That has a lot of benefits for that, because that allows the company to be very flexible for a country, but it also has some criticism. The World Health Assembly 2 years ago passed a resolution on net price transparency for medical technologies. So there is a feeling that we should know more about these prices. It's a topic for a different talk, but I'm very concerned about that, because I would expect that this will reduce the flexibility that companies have to implement differential pricing across the world, and that will lead to a situation that we had 10 years ago, that there will only be a very limited corridor of prices in the world. So I want to come to my summary and conclusions here, and look forward to the questions that will come after that. What we have to see here is innovative medicines, and I'm always saying medicines, but I really think of medical technologies. It's the same for medical devices and diagnostics and digital therapeutics. There are global public good, in the sense that everybody can benefit from the knowledge that has been produced without depleting this knowledge. They're protected through a temporary monopoly, which allows the inventor to charge a price that is based on value rather than cost. But then we also said that after a certain period, this monopoly expires, and then the price will converge to a cost plus price. So then we have these inventions available at a much lower cost. Value extends beyond the clinical benefit and cost, and depends on the respective stakeholder perspective and the context in which we are looking at that. So value-based price, in the end, always tries to reflect the benefit that this technology delivers to patients, to health systems, to societies. This varies across countries. Implementing value-based prices often requires innovative contracts to account for uncertainty, heterogeneity, but also to adjust for the different prices across different indications and between different countries. So with that, I hope that I've brought a little bit more transparency to the concept of value-based prices. You may have heard that I'm quite passionate about this, because I think it brings together both a good reward for the inventor, but also ensures that there is affordability for these medicines, because value differs between different countries. And I think that we should all support mechanisms and infrastructures that can implement differential prices.
Jens, thank you so much for an excellent presentation. And as you were talking, I was just blown away by the information that you have been sharing with us this afternoon or this evening. I hope this is going to lead to a book that we hope will come out something in 2022 on value-based pricing. There are a lot of questions in the chat box, and there are a lot of people who have raised some issues. In the interest of time, I'm going to see if we can pick up a few, and hopefully we'll have about 20 minutes to answer all of them. But I would like to actually start with a member who's also on the call. This is Elena Gross. She is the CEO of an interesting company which is called Keroswiss. Now, Elena is a very passionate CEO, and this is one of the reasons I really like her company. But she is perhaps in a bit of a quandary because she has a product which I think is quite innovative, quite revolutionary in terms of therapy, but it sits somewhere between a pharmaceutical and a food supplement. And the question is, how do you actually assign value to that kind of therapy? I would, Elena, if you would like to ask that question yourself or related question, just unmute yourself, please, and ask the question directly.
Thanks a lot, Salman. I very much appreciate your intro. Fantastic talk. Thanks a lot, Jens. My question is actually, for me, it's hard to get my head around excluding the cost of goods completely. So my question is predominantly, is it fair if something that is literally saving the lives of millions, say we found a cure for cancer or in our case, migraine, and you completely disregard cost of goods that could be super cheap, but because it's so valuable, you sell it at 50,000 per patient, and then just a very small selected number of patients can get access to that drug. We know it's the case in migraine, only very high frequency migraine cases can get access to this new migraine CGRP monoclonal antibodies just because costs are high. There's actually maybe so that it could be cheaper. Pharma would still get a huge return of investment. Everybody would get their money back, but there would be more access to patients. So yeah, my question is, disregarding cost of goods completely in this model, is that fair?
I think there are two components to that. The first one is, does the value-based price reflect cost of goods? And indeed, you're right, it does not. It does not in the sense that if the cost of goods are low, then the price will not be lower. If the cost of goods are high, then the price cannot be higher for this. So we have with both situations. I think it's an important aspect in here because otherwise you would be rewarding inefficiency. I mean, I can make the cost of good as high as I want if I just have a very inefficient process in synthesizing the molecule or doing other kinds of things around it. I'm not rewarded for that if I cannot find a way to make this work. And then be linked to that price, I will not be able to commercialize it. Somebody else might be able to. So indeed, I mean, for this limited period of time, cost don't play a direct role into that. They play a role for your second point. And I mean, the first thing I would say is value-based price is not inhibiting access. The value-based price, if it's truly based on value, if a country has a GDP per capita, this is typically what people use as a starting point to look at differential pricing. If the price is set for a country like Germany, somewhere around $30,000 to $50,000 per capita per year, now we have a country in a lower middle income bracket, maybe $1,000 to $3,000, $1,000 to $5,000 per capita. And the price should be of a factor of 20 to 30 below that, so at a level of 5% of that. And if the company can produce it at that point, they would actually be able also to commercialize it in that country and create access for patients. So it actually increases access. The problem is if the company then says, yeah, I recognize that there is a 20 to 30% differential in affordability and ability to pay for these medicines, but I'm only giving you a 20 or 30% lower price for it, then this other country has to overpay for this, and then this will not work. But we have seen these examples. So I mentioned hepatitis C. So when this company came out with this medicine about 10 years ago, there was a price in the US that was $84,000 per year. There was a price in Egypt that was $1,000 for the full course of therapy in there. So this company actually was able to differentiate the price in line with the ability of the countries to pay for that. And I mean, where that is possible, it actually then increases access.
But I think, Jens, in all fairness, and the company, of course, we're talking about is Gilead, and which really kind of shot to fame. In all fairness, they did that, I have to say, a little bit grudgingly. They were, it was an incredible innovative breakthrough, that you take one therapy and with that, you get rid of the affliction. But I think there was, frankly, looking back on it, I think they could have handled the pricing issue better from a PR perspective. That's just a personal comment that I have. I don't know what other people think in the panel.
I have the microphone, so I can. I fully agree with you. I mean, the story could have been so simple. We're not charging $1 more than the current therapies that you have been paying for the last 20 years, and we are now delivering a vastly superior product. It cures, I think it was in the beginning 95% of the patients, and some genotypes it's up to 100% of the patients. So they could have handled that piece better. I think they were actually quite quick to give licenses to Indian companies to produce that for low and middle income countries. They had the price for Egypt, which was much lower, here they were actually criticized for that, because people then said, well, how can it be that it's only 1,000 here and it's 84,000 in the US? Are you ripping off the US health system? I mean, that is also something where it was difficult to explain, but they could have made a better effort at explaining why is it absolutely appropriate to have such a price differential in here. Yep. The third thing I would say is that, of course, in the end, this was all a moot point, because quite quickly after that, other companies brought similar direct-acting antiviral products to market. The competition came in, and once you have the competition, you're not in the value-based price situation anymore. Today, we're paying less than $10,000 for a course of treatment for these medicines, and they're actually better than the original medicines that came out. So. Value-based pricing, the protection through the patents does not protect from the competition. When others are able to do similar things better, then they will get the market, and then prices will come down.
Perfect. Now, by the way, you also see on your screens, Jens has very kindly, as requested, has put his email address also. So please feel free to get in touch with Jens. If you have any problems doing that, just drop us, myself or Andre, a short note, and we'll make sure that your questions is conveyed to Jens, if that's okay with you, Jens.
Absolutely.
Yep.
And now that you've said that, I will stop sharing, because then I can also see more of you.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so Anup, you have asked a number of questions. Would you like to unmute and ask your questions, perhaps a summary question to Jens?
Thank you, Salman. I think the basic tenet of my questions, there were a couple, but the summary is that when we talk about value pricing, it differs not only by the geography you are in or the indication, but actually at the individual level. And to be provocative, like Salman suggested, the value for an old person is less than the value for a young person, or indeed for a person with disabilities, in the sense that if you have a blind person, then the value of a drug is theoretically lower than for a person who is not with disabilities. Because if this were not the case, then there is no value to curing blindness.
There you go. How's that for provocation on a Wednesday afternoon?
You're absolutely right. And I mean, it's not perfect. And I mean, there are certain aspects of the variability across patients that are perfectly okay. And every health system around the world would say we are not biasing against elderly people. We are not taking gender or other aspects into consideration in the price, and we are not taking into consideration people's ability to pay in a kind of reimbursed system for them. When it's non-reimbursed and the patient have to pay themselves, then it's a different point where it makes total sense, and also to vary that price. So I think we are trying to get closer to then reflecting the different clinical outcomes for that. We still have clinical variability in patients that are otherwise demographically very similar. I mean, we're not often talking about that, but even kind of household medicines that we all use all the time, maybe that only 50% of the patients are responding to that. If it is cheap medicines, we can just live with that, and we can just say, okay, the price is 50% of the responders, 50% of the non-responders. If it's an expensive medicine, you want to have a different approach for that. That's where these performance-based agreements come into play, and that's where people are giving this kind of money back guarantee. I don't know exactly kind of whether you will respond for this, but you will only pay if you respond for this. And I think that takes care of this to the extent that we can do that. But I mean, your challenge is absolutely accepted, and it's the biggest criticism for some of those instruments like the QALY. I'm not a great fan of the QALY, but we don't have anything better at this point in time to then kind of condense everything into one simple number that we can work with. There will always be variations, but I think we're getting closer to a fair system that rewards the benefits of these technologies.
I mean, don't forget that the pharma industry, this is an old dog of more than 40 years in the industry, saying that we are not among the quickest when it comes to adapting to change. And it's good to see, that especially on the pricing front, that there are pressures now from both within the industry, but also from outside, which is forcing the industry to change. And I think it's positive. I mean, I think it, if you look only at the US as an example, I think the pricing situation there is going to go through some changes. Unfortunately, also prompted by very strong political pressures. I'd like to move on to a couple of other questions. I'm conscious of time. We have Jeff, who is sitting patiently in deep down in Singapore, who's an old campaigner. And we also then have Jermaine, who has asked us a couple of questions. So, Jeff, any quick comment from your side? And then I would ask Jermaine if you'd like to ask your question, please, to Jens. If you could unmute yourself, Jeff.
Oh, hi. Yeah, I think I tapped the question before the Novartis CAR-T example was flashed up, but really curious about more like example if the presenter happens to know of that resulted in sort of sustainable outcome for both the companies, because companies do have to show ROI as well as for the patients alike. Okay. Yeah, example of that kind of strategy.
So, Jermaine, are you also in Singapore?
Oh, yes. Hi.
Okay, good. So, Jeff, please come in then after Jermaine.
No problem.
Okay, so go ahead, Jens.
So, I mean, first of all, there are two kinds of these performance guarantees. They can be at an individual level and they can be at a population level. Individual is often what you have for cancers, for example, that you say, okay, if I'm not seeing that these patients have at least 6 months of progression-free survival, then I consider that the drug hasn't done its benefit to these patients, and then the money has to be paid back. This is kind of individual patient, and it is you have to then follow the patients. Often countries are implementing certain registries for that. Often, of course, for cancer patients or for rare disease patients, for children that are born with a genetic defect, they are anyway kind of followed very closely. So we have that information in the health system. We just need to bring that together, and then we can do that at an individual level. In other situations, you can do that also at a population level. So there have been many attempts in different countries to say that, well, when we look at diabetes, for example, we know that there will be different outcomes, how well we can control blood pressure, blood sugar in these patients. But with better treatment, we should be able to get 60, 80, 90% of patients to their blood sugar goal. And so then you can also have this link to the population effect in there, so to that percentage. Both of these things, in a way, kind of the implementation depends on what data do I have for this. In Singapore, you have a really good data system, one of the most advanced value-based healthcare systems in the world. I'm sure that things can be done easily. On the other hand, I think these contracts are not very popular yet in Singapore. Some other countries have set up systems now. Italy, since 2006, has a system to work with this. Other countries are struggling with that. So often the major implementation issue at the moment is data. But I'm very optimistic that, the one thing in the year 2000, we all thought that our computers were malfunctioning, and then we had a great improvement in the internet. In 2019-20, after the COVID pandemic, we will have a leap jump in the quality of healthcare data that we are collecting, and that will be useful also for these approaches. So to give you an idea, at the moment there are about 280 of these agreements in practice in Italy alone, and many more in the US. Most of them are in severe diseases like cancer, but people are also now going into more complex diseases. So about a year ago, an interesting arrangement in multiple sclerosis was announced in the US between a pharma company and the University of Philadelphia medical system. And that is based on the quality of life that patients are experiencing. Not just, do they say, I feel good? Quality of life in the kind of psychometric sense. Do they have better function? Do they have better emotions? So this is a very ambitious project, really linking it to outcomes that are relevant to patients.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So over to you, Jeff. And after Jeff, if I can ask James Leong, if you could kindly also ask your question. But Jeff, you go first, please.
Thank you. Jens, first of all, good to see you again. It's been a long time. And thank you. A very clear presentation. I was thinking your students at University of Washington are very lucky. That's very, very nice presentation.
I make it more complex to them.
So, my question a little bit, you talked a lot about, value-based contracts and some of the really, interesting and new things, but they've tended to be in the more sophisticated, more mature markets who also, not only have, I guess, the ability to pay, but also the ability to analyze data and make assessments about how to, align on the value. So sitting in Asia, my question a little bit is, where do you see the ability to do these kind of arrangements in markets where maybe the capability to assess the value and analyze data might be not so well developed yet?
Well, that's a very good question, and I cannot kind of fully answer that. It is true at the moment the majority of these arrangements are in North America, Western Europe, and Australia. Very few outside of that. On the other hand, smartphone use in many of these other geographies is very high, and I've always been impressed. We were looking at these things in Kenya. Kenya has a system which is called MTIVA, which is a kind of smartphone-based payment system. And within the smartphone-based payment system, you can also have special mechanisms, how you pay for your health insurance, how you pay for drugs. And in many of these cases, you could use that system already. You know that the patient, there is no public insurance. This is out-of-pocket paying patients. So you could link that to the information when the patient needs the next course of therapy. They would order this therapy. You could link that to some information about kind of what has been the effect for that. Can you get a complex cancer outcome from a patient? Probably not, but I'm sure that there are ways that we can bring these things together. So it is not happening at the moment. I would not be surprised if over the next couple of years we see these things coming up, because patients, the epidemiology is shifting in these geographies. Cardiovascular and metabolism cancer are now the big killers in these countries. So health systems will want to provide better care for that. And they will also struggle with the uncertainty around, are we really getting the outcome? So they will want to know if we cover these medicines, can we also get feedback from providers and from patients that we're getting these benefits? And if we're not getting the benefits, how do we also bring in the inventor, the manufacturer, and have them share in the risk of producing these outcomes?
Okay, interesting.
I cannot give you a concrete example, but I'm sure that they will be coming soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. James, you had a couple of questions, and I'm conscious of time. We probably will overrun Jens by about 5 minutes, if that's okay with you. James?
Yes, hi, Salman. Yes, I have one quick question. So I believe that this value-based pricing is only used by the originator or the innovator. So what about the generic company? Do they use a cost-plus pricing method?
So James, you're also sitting in Singapore, right?
I'm in Shanghai, actually.
You're in Shanghai now, okay.
Yeah.
I mean, basically, so that's a great question. That was what I was trying to allude to. Of course, after expiration of the patent, the product, the formula is available to everybody. And so that is where usual market-based forces would come into play. Whoever is able to produce cheaper and make this medicine available for health systems, for patients at a lower cost, will get the business for that. People will not sell under cost, people will not sell at cost. There still has to be a certain profit margin that they can generate from their operations. But clearly, if somebody has a better process, a higher yield in pharmaceutical manufacturing, then they have a chance to get that business. And so that is why we have seen, these examples. I was at Pfizer when Lipitor, at that time in 2011, the largest selling medicine in the world for dyslipidemia, it lost its exclusivity in the US, and within 6 weeks, the price imploded by 95%, and all of the business was generic, because these companies are also producing high quality product at large scale, and they can make it much cheaper, and they have to make it much cheaper based on competition. And of course, we are seeing similar things now happening in China. Just at the beginning, we were talking about the fact that PD-1, PD-L1 inhibitors, so one of the great inventions now in immuno-oncology, they are now available in China for $5,000 per year. They cost $20,000 per month in the US. It will be interesting when these products are also registered in the US, at what price Chinese companies will then bring them to market, but that will bring some competition to the current multinational companies that are selling these drugs at higher prices. So that competition is already starting before the expiration of the patent, when these products are not infringing on the patent of the originator.
Interesting. We have a kind of a provocative question from Bichara Sab. Bichara, do you want to ask the question to Jens?
Sure, my pleasure. Yes, Bichara Sab, Mobile Interactive Digital Theragnostics. I'm not trying to advocate at all for penalties on innovators, but more of a thought experiment. So if we're interested in having value-based reimbursement, does it make sense to also consider the whole patient outcome and maybe give penalties if there are side effects that induce some other sort of cost for the healthcare system or incur pain or detriment to the patient? And the reason why I want to bring up that thought experiment is to see if maybe not there's possibility for some weighting in how much you would pay relative to the overall outcome for the patient. So health outcomes that aren't specific to the exact indication being targeted, but rather to how the patient does, and then by that measure, medicine that does less harm to the patient while curing the disease, would be more valuable and priced that way. So that's kind of what I wanted to discuss.
Oh, very good question, Bishara. And it's not a thought experiment. I mean, that is actually what should be happening. I mean, I've articulated it positively, speaking about the benefits, but also, of course, you have to factor in the harms. So when you look at what's the kind of relative effectiveness of this new therapy, both benefits and harms are taken into consideration. Benefits in the sense that you may avoid certain complications, harms in the sense that you need additional monitoring for these patients to protect from side effects, or you need to treat these side effects. So that's all included in this assessment. I think an important element that you also, of course, bring in that there may be things that help us to better predict which drugs will work in which patients. And that is kind of where digital diagnostics, digital biomarkers, and these technologies come into play. It's an interesting one. I've been doing some work at the University of Washington then to speak about what's the value-based price for these diagnostics. In principle, in the past, people always said, well, it's still the medicine that produces the benefit. It's the diagnostic that helps us to avoid the harms, because you're targeting the medicine to the patient that will have the best benefit. Because I think, as you also indicated, the problem with the side effects is they usually accrue to everybody. and the benefits only accrue to some of the people in there. So if you have a diagnostic that identifies those patients prospectively, you can avoid a lot of harm in there. And then so in the value-based setting, people said, well, the medicine produces a benefit, diagnostic avoids the harm. I think nowadays we actually have diagnostics. I'm thinking, for example, of gene sequencing, complex molecular diagnostic procedures. When a cancer patient goes through that at the beginning of the kind of treatment sequence in there, which is not happening all the time at the moment. At the moment, often it is. I mean, you start one therapy, it doesn't work, then you test for something, then you try the next one, and after 3 or 4 attempts, you may get to the right medicine for that. If you do comprehensive genomic profiling at the beginning, you can have a treatment strategy that avoids that trial and error, and you actually produce a benefit through this diagnostic, through this better targeting, because in cancer, time is important. You don't have the time to kind of run 3 or 4 treatment trials before you get to that right medicine. So diagnostics and new algorithmic approaches, they are actually producing significant patient benefits, and these should also be rewarded on a value-based on a value-based price, which is not happening at the moment, but there are some examples, and you probably know them, like genomic health, that have been paid based on value for quite some time. So these are interesting developments.
Thank you so much, Jens. I'm very conscious of time, yours as well as ours, and some people have to go back to work. But the last question, if I may ask, Agnieszka, you're sitting in Basel, if you could kindly ask your question. I will, by the way, we will share all the questions with Jens that have come through the chat box, and we will follow up the questions and later on, if that's okay with you, Jens.
Absolutely. I may then be a little bit more concise in my response.
Yeah. Agi, over to you. Last question.
Yes, thank you, Jens. Excellent talk. I'm actually studying right now healthcare economics and HBA courses and master program. And I'm very curious, what's your comments in terms of future innovation in healthcare economics, as well as can you touch base a little bit about the ethics in healthcare economics? Thank you.
Yes, that is a longer discussion. I mean, first of all, innovation comes in 2 forms. First of all, we would say better outcomes, that's the innovation. And so that is already rewarded. But then, of course, people would say, well, innovation comes also through scientific spillovers. So if we go to that first example of the first Alzheimer's therapy that has now been approved in the US, lots of criticism, but I mean, positively, finally, we have something that we can kind of observe how it works. We can find out, are there differences in outcomes for different patients? That will allow to kind of jumpstart the development of the next generation of these kinds of medicines. So this medicine is at the beginning of a pyramid of innovation that we're going to see. And so there should also be some reward for that therapeutic spillover, a scientific spillover that we have. There is a paper I would refer you to. It's from ISPOR, so I'm now speaking with my presidential hat on. It's about the value framework, sometimes referred to as the value flower, where the authors, Grueger and Peter Newman and Darius Lakdawala and some others, I mean, they're also speaking about these other aspects of value and innovation, scientific spillovers, other things that are about option value that is created with these therapies that are discussed in there. So that would be quite instructive for you.
So Jens, if you could kindly share that paper with me, and I'll make sure that we have it.
Of course.
With
it's a whole
I would also appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah. And the ethics, I mean, that is, of course, goes back to the question that we also had about do we differentiate between different kinds of patients? Is it ethical to reward patients in high unmet need more than patients with a disease like hypertension that everybody has? Is there a benefit of treating patients with rare conditions? It's a big discussion. It's still under investigated how to bring in the ethics. everybody would say ethics and legal aspects are important when we discuss the use of these medicines. I mean, ethics in the terms of are we achieving equitable access for that, legal, what does it mean about the information that we are sharing, that we need to get from this. So very important points. I will also look for a reference that I can send you where the ethical dimensions are discussed.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Once again, I'm sorry that we have overshot our time, Jens. A great discussion, a great presentation, and we will do a follow-up. Just to let you know that our next session is going to be on real-world evidence in mental health, and that will be on the 25th of November. We will have the Holmus guys, both Stefan Sutter sitting here in Switzerland and his colleague in China, talking about, actually it's the world's first real-world evidence in mental health database that they have put together. So you'll be hearing about that in due course. And with all that said, thank you so much, Jens, for your time. Really appreciate you taking time out from your holidays on your other commitments. And till we meet again.
Thank you very much, all.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.